If you are in crypto right now and you are like me, you've probably spent a fair amount of time trying to think about where are we currently at in the space. Well, if you take a look around, there is no shortage of people trying to get you to believe certain narratives, certain ideals, certain theses that they have crafted. Some are better than others, but to answer your question, that is where we are at in the current state of things. There's only a small percentage of people who actually have a fundamental understanding of what's going on in the space. The rest of the people, market participants for the most part, are just guessing. And if you're taking your styling cues from social media, which I would highly advise against, you're probably seeing videos pop up from people who have strong convictions in certain projects or people who have been paid to talk about certain projects. Right now, there's a big media push from Ethereum. You're seeing pages like Coin Bureau put out super bullish, super positive videos about Ethereum.
5 reasons why Ethereum is still going strong and why the tide may finally be turning for ETH holders.
Here's the problem. Anybody who's been paying attention to what's been going over at Ether for the last year and a half, you know that Ethereum's run into a bit of a headwind. So no matter what anybody tries to tell you with their fancy pants backgrounds and beautiful bokeh displays, there's a lot more regarding Ethereum that you need to be paying attention to if it's going to make up a certain percentage of your portfolio. And in this video, we're going to get into it. So I'm going to break down some of the rhetoric that we're hearing from Coin Bureau, what I definitely disagree with, and how things should have been framed appropriately. So the first thing that you're going to hear when you sit down and you watch this video that was published 3 days ago, Ethereum's comeback will shock you, only to be followed up 3 days later with another super bullish Ethereum video, is that when you watch this video, the gentleman goes on to break down some things where he says, hey, there is a lot of institutional interest that is turning their gaze to Ethereum, and this is going to have a meteoric rise in Ethereum's price. Now, on the surface, I understand where that ideology comes from. After all, when Bitcoin started to be shown attention from the institutions, Bitcoin's price went through a meteoric rise. The problem with that is everyone is thinking just because it happened to Bitcoin, it's got to happen with other assets alike, when that's not the case. Back in 2025, when I started to outline what I thought were some of the boxes that needed to check to see if an asset would have significant price appreciation if it started to be shown favorable adoption by institutions, those boxes were as follows. 1, the market needed to be showing a healthy appetite for this asset prior to it even getting any kind of exposure or any kind of interest by the institutions. 2, if in fact an ETF was going to come, it needed to be sponsored, it needed to be published or produced by a large issuer. When you start to take a look at all these other assets that started getting their ETFs, Ethereum, Solana, some of the other altcoins, they didn't necessarily behave a certain kind of way. Why? Again, go back to that checklist that I just mentioned. Number 1, the market wasn't showing a healthy appetite for these assets prior to them actually getting their ETF debut. Second of all, if it was an ETF-like product, like the one that came from Solana, where it was kind of ETP, but it really wasn't an ETF product, it wasn't made available by a large issuer. These large issuers, they have a history of launching successful ETFs. Not only that, but they also have a healthy book of business that people that they can sell those products to. Look at how other ETFs centered around altcoins fared out. A lot of them didn't have the same kind of appreciation that Bitcoin had, and for good reason. So while he may be correct that yes, there is some institutional interest being shown to Ethereum by the institutional players, it's not like retail as of right now has a direct way that they can extract value from that interest. And that therein lies the problem. When I came back from Consensus, the number one idea, the number one conversation that I would have with people is, how does retail capture value from any of this? Because if there's one thing I've known for sure, is cycle after cycle, people can continuously be positioned wrong in crypto, which ultimately leads to the degradation of the returns or just not seeing the kind of returns that they want to achieve at all. For instance, in 2025, late 2024, let me backtrack, I was probably one of the only voices on social media telling people that we would not see a traditional alt season in 25. There was nothing in the macroeconomic forecast that suggested for it. When you would pay attention to what the Fed was saying about how much money people had in savings, it was at pre-COVID lows. And ultimately, when you went to the conferences, people were not talking about altcoins. They were talking about one asset and one asset in particular. They were talking about Bitcoin. So to me, it was all but clear. If you want to see success in 2025, you need to be positioned in Bitcoin. And if you go back and you take a look at the vast majority of the information or publications I put out in late 2024, going into 25, they were all saying the same thing. We will not have a traditional alt season if we even get an alt season at all. and everyone who was positioned in alt season because they wanted to hold true to the 4-year cycle, they didn't fare out well. Now, I'm not saying the 4-year cycle is dead. In fact, I think the 4-year cycle is definitely alive and kicking. I just think over the years it has been skewed. It's been the Bitcoin 4-year cycle and not the Bitcoin and alt season 4-year cycle. So back to my point with Coin Bureau. While they say that there is some institutional interest being shown to Ethereum, again, it's not that retail can capture any of that interest in a direct kind of fashion without having to go a roundabout kind of way. In fact, when you take a look at some of Ethereum's biggest players like BlackRock and BUIDL, there's no direct way for people of retail to invest directly into BUIDL and benefit from that. So we can have all the institutional interests being shown to Ethereum all day long. It doesn't do retail any good if there's not a way for us to get in and capture any of that value. Number dos, when he goes on to say that there's all these companies that are, buying Ethereum for Ethereum treasury reserve companies and all that. When you take a look at the performance of Ethereum's price compared to how Bitcoin's price reacted, there's a stark difference between the two. When the trend was Bitcoin treasury companies coming out, Bitcoin's price again started to go through its meteoric rise because the market was already starting to demonstrate a healthy appetite for that asset prior to any institutions showing any interest in Bitcoin. With Ethereum, if we have all these companies allegedly that are becoming Ethereum treasury reserve companies or listing Ethereum as a treasury reserve on their balance sheet, yet Ethereum's price is still what it is, that doesn't bode well for the argument that, hey, this is going to lead to significant Ethereum adoption, which is going to lead to significant price appreciation for Ethereum. If anything, if the metric is, hey, we want to start utilizing these digital assets that are going to provide income for us, that's something like Hyperliquid. Oh, with Hyperliquid right now, they have this really cool mechanic where they're going in using some of the proceeds from the organization to actually buy back their tokens, which obviously if you're holding the token, that could actually equal into positive price appreciation for the asset. And there's a lot less moving pieces. The problem that Ethereum has with it is right now Ethereum again is running into a bit of a headwind, right? We're supposed to have all these talks about gas reducing updates and updates that are going to lead to this, updates that are going to lead to that. None of those updates have actually come to fruition. In fact, what do we see at ETH Denver? We saw this huge rushed, might I add, push for Ethereum to be more AI centered. But when you listen to how this presentation was being issued or presented, it was very clear that this was not something that was on Ethereum's radar over the last 12, 24, 36 months. It's almost like AI became this cool narrative and Ethereum needed to attach itself onto a narrative to prevent itself from falling into obscurity. Now, it pains me to say that. I'm the same person who was saying last year when everyone was ready to write ETH off at around $2,500, $2,200, I said, hey, wait a minute, Ethereum will come back, it will rebound, and it will see a positive price action. And Ethereum then went to $4,000. The problem that Ethereum has now is certain variables that are present now were not present back then. When you take a listen to what's going on with Ethereum, you have executives leaving the Ethereum Foundation. You're hearing Ethereum leadership talk about eliminating L2s and trying to bring a lot of that attention back to Ethereum L1s. You're starting to hear a lot of talk about making the organization lean and more slimmer. These are not talking points that come about when an organization is doing fantastic. No, this is exactly the rhetoric that we hear in traditional corporate America structures when a company is going through problematic hard times and facing insurmountable tasks. The other thing that I would think separates Bitcoin's performance from Ethereum's performance and how these two meet in the grand scheme of things is Bitcoin didn't necessarily have to have all these organizations that were tasked with the responsibility of trying to force adoption, where Ethereum, that's really what you're starting to see right now. Problem with that is a lot of these companies, while yes, it looks great on a headline, companies fall and collapse and fold all the time. Who's to say we won't see some of that with Ethereum? Now, I'm not presenting these facts because I want to be a Debbie Downer or I want to prevent people from buying Ethereum. I'm simply just saying if Ethereum is something that you have an interest in, you need to know exactly what you're getting yourselves into and don't get excited about the potential possibilities because a video that's polished and produced really well comes out and says all these great things about Ethereum. And if you really want to get a good understanding to see if Ethereum really still even has traction or not, ask yourself this question, because I'm a firm believer in sometimes you just got to take the Pepsi challenge taste. So ask yourself this question. When was the last time you or members of your group or community interacted in anything DeFi related on Ethereum? Don't worry, I'll wait. Because for the last year and a half, a lot of the talk as regards to DeFi has been primarily on Solana. And I know there's a lot of people who think Solana is just a meme coin casino, but you would be wrong. Solana has a lot of things going for it right now, are just kind of waiting in the wings, or acting as an underpin to a meteoric rise for Solana's price. More on that information in this video right here. And I know it's a long video, but I encourage you to watch it. You're probably going to learn something that you didn't know about Solana. And when you take the Pepsi challenge, you compare Ethereum to another top contender L1 like Solana, you see that the two really don't compare. And the overall message that Coin Bureau wants you to believe doesn't exactly pan out. And I'm going to blow these up so that you can actually see them in their entirety. And what you're going to notice here is, as well as the 24-hour metrics compared to when you stretch this out and look at it over, say, like the last year and a half, Ethereum isn't exactly the fan favorite, which, again, I'm not surprised, because when, in fact, you take a look at when the last time someone has actually interacted with something on Ethereum in terms of DeFi, that conversation isn't really being had across crypto. So let's take a look at some of these metrics. When you take a look at the overall chain fees in the last 24 hours, Ethereum comes in at around 256,000 compared to chain fees on Solana at 614,000. When you take a look at the second category of chain revenue, in terms of what both chains have collected in the last 24 hours, the second one actually measures real economic value. And for Ethereum, that was around 438,000. But when you compare it to Solana, it's over $250,000. It's actually over $750,000 in just the last 24 hours alone. The DEX revenue, when you look at it for Ethereum, is just around $713 million. However, when you take a look at where that stacks up against Solana, the actual overall DEX volume in the last 24 hours is 1.6 billion. There's clearly more activity going on in terms of DeFi, in terms of, ecosystem vibrancy. People that are just interacting with the protocol more on Solana than a chain like Ethereum. So I don't know what Coin Bureau is talking about when they're trying to push forward this narrative that there's all these exciting things going on over at Ethereum. I would make the argument that while you have tokenization and real world assets taking place on Ethereum, you also have that happening on Solana and so much more. And in fact, when you take a look at the numbers of who is actually interacting with each one of these protocols, the numbers actually favor Solana. Going back to my next point, if the majority of the arguments that were made by Coin Bureau, were centered around, well, companies would want to go to Ethereum because of the income generation mechanism, there's a few things that you would take a look at. While Ethereum does, in fact, have staking, one thing that you've got to account for is that there's no cap on Ethereum, so there's nothing to continuously dilute you as time goes on. The other thing is you're paid out in a mechanism where the underlying asset can actually be devalued. So say if you get paid out for your staking efforts on Ethereum, the market starts to go through a bit of a downtick. The Ethereum that you're getting paid off essentially is going down in value as well. In fact, I think there's other protocols out there that offer maybe better incentive for income generation. Right now, Hyperliquid seems to have been able to capture lightning in a bottle, and at least in that regard, I believe you're actually paid out in dollars. So if the name of the game is trying to acquire assets that have this built-in payment mechanism, either by staking or token buybacks, I think the advantage would actually go to a protocol like Hyperliquid, at least for now. Now, in the name of being objective, there are some things that when we actually take a look at where Solana and Ethereum compete with one another, how they stack up against one another, there are avenues where Ethereum outperforms Solana, such as stablecoin market cap and information as it regards to information as it pertains to perps volume in the last 24 hours. I will say this, though, where Ethereum has an advantage on Solana is got more of a network effect. It's been around longer. There's more familiarity that's with it. However, if you were to take a look at how quickly Solana is maybe potentially catching Ethereum, I think that would be an argument that would be warranted as well. Just a few metrics to take a look here. When you take a look at things like chain fees, chain revenue, app revenue, and active addresses, there's a few here that I want to pay attention to because I think these can kind of represent the amount of activity that has in fact taken place on either one of these blockchains, right? If we take a look at chain fee, for instance, from January 1 to December 31st, so about for the entirety of this year, as far as we can forecast, chain fees for Solana have been 127.93 million versus Ethereum, where it's just coming in at around 100 million. When you take a look at app revenue for Ethereum, we're around $475 million, where app revenue for Solana is currently sitting at 715 million. Take a look at active addresses on Solana, 469.8 million. Active addresses for Ethereum, 132. This is why I say you have to be careful about the kind of information you take in, especially at this point in the market, right? People who would want to be disingenuous, they try to paint forth a narrative, and oftentimes these narratives are crafted from a protocol that may have reached out to media to perpetuate a certain image of their protocol. They're trying to generate some buzz or some hype to get people excited about it. When in actuality, you come to DeFi Llama, you take a look at the information as it's presented on here: chain fees, chain revenue, app revenue, active addresses for the last 24 hours, especially if you zoom out to a year. Most times they paint a very different story than the ones that you're hearing on YouTube. So where are we currently at in this market cycle? Where we are at this current market cycle is retail needs to be asking themselves two things. Anytime you watch a piece of content, be it on TikTok, YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, wherever the case is, you have to ask yourself, what's the agenda here? The person who published this content, what do they want me to take away from it? The other thing you've got to ask yourself is, the other thing you have to ask yourself is the information I'm taking in, is this objective? If I were to go and look this information up on my own, would I walk away with the same takeaways? One last piece, I think where we're currently at in this cycle is you've got to understand that it's super important to audit the content that you consume, but more importantly, it's also important for you to audit the sources of that content. Most times, again, people have an agenda that they want you to fall into, be it buy a project, stay away from a project, wherever the case may be. Seldomly does a greater good outweigh own self-interest. When I created this video, it was only to try to push back on some of the narratives that Coin Bureau was pushing, a lot of the videos that they had been promoting as it regards to Ethereum as of the last couple of weeks. I know that in this space, it's very easy for someone else to do the thinking for you. And it's so important for you to own that part of your investing journey, because you are not going to lie to you, or at least I hope you wouldn't lie to yourself. So that's going to do it for this video. Again, just be mindful where you get information from. Be mindful of the information that's being presented to you, and just always take everything that you see on social media with a grain of salt and consider the source and do your own due diligence, because your ROI is dependent upon the level of intelligence that you utilize for your investment theory. If you get the intelligence wrong as it pertains to your investment thesis, it's going to play out in the kind of ROI you either get or you don't get as we proceed into the market.